So first of all, thank you, Bob. And I have to say, having spent 3.5 years in Washington, D.C., which is nicknamed the swamp, not only for the politics, but also because of the climate. Indeed, British soldiers during the American Revolution used to be paid tropical pay when they were stationed in Washington, D.C., so I thought I was prepared for hot, humid weather, but this is a little bit on another level. So I wanted to talk today about two economic recoveries from economic recession. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, in part because the majority of my adult life, and presumably much of your adult lives, has been spent either in recession or in protracted recovery from recession. And it's perhaps a little bit acutely felt in my head because, as Bob alluded to, in 2020, I was in the situation of writing memos to the President of the United States reporting the biggest job loss in US history, the biggest output decline in US history, the biggest job gain in US history, the biggest output growth in US history. So recession has very much been on my mind in recent years. And I wanted to share some perspective on these two most recent economic recoveries from what were actually the two deepest economic recessions in the United States, and indeed in many economies around the world, since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And to share some perspective on the economic policy response to those recessions and what we can maybe learn from them. And I want to make two broad points. The first is that it's often very tempting to think about episodes of economic contraction in terms of demand. In part because you look around during a recession and you see investment demand goes down, consumption goes down, prices, or at the very least, inflation typically goes down, and we see demand for workers go down. We see net job losses. And it has a certain appeal as well because in the simplicity of the explanation, there's a very simple, appealing response, and that is for the public sector to step in and plug the gap left by that deferred demand. And it scratches our itch. It scratches our itch for the logical fallacy that, well, we must do something, this is something, we must do this. But I would contend, and I will contend, that economic recovery from recession is very much protracted when policy impairs the recovery of the supply side of the economy. So policies, there was a lot of talk after 2008, 2009 about secular stagnation. You might have heard this term, that there just was insufficient demand in the economy that the public sector needed to step up. But without rejecting secular stagnation, I would actually have a different interpretation of it. That if you have policies in place that lower the future potential output of the economy, you're going to get lower investment today. Lower investment today means less plant and equipment, less capital tomorrow. Less capital tomorrow means lower output tomorrow. So you can get trapped in this sort of low-level, suboptimal equilibrium. The second point, broad point I want to make is that we know recessions are costly. Indeed, they're very costly. And they hurt a lot of people. Yet, there's a remarkable phenomenon when you zoom out, as Larry did yesterday, when you zoom out to the really long run and look at any number of macroeconomic time series, GDP is the most obvious one, but you can look at capital stock, you can look at employment. Recessions are deviations. Recessions are deviations from long-run trend. And what ultimately matters for long-run economic prosperity are the conditions that determine that long-run trend. So, speaking of recoveries and trends, the first economic recovery that I started looking at when I entered government was basically a recovery from the slowest recovery in US history. So 2008, 2009, we have a pretty deep recession, and it's an anomalous recession because ordinarily in US and UK and in other economies, the deeper the contraction, the sharper the rebound. This is what Milton Friedman called the plucking model. So you can envision a string on a bow, and someone comes along and plucks. And you get this dip, and then you get a rebound. And that's typically the pattern of recession, certainly in the US and in many other economies. But that didn't happen in the aftermath of 2008, 2009. And in fact, if you look back over the past 150 years, there are only two exceptions to that plucking model pattern: the Great Depression of the 1930s and the aftermath of 2008, 2009. I mean, just to put this in perspective, since the end of World War II, on average, it took 24 months, so 2 years, for the US economy to regain all the jobs lost in recession. After 2008, 77 months, 6.5 years, just to regain the jobs that were lost. Now, why was it so slow? As with many things in economic history, it's overdetermined, by which I mean you have one outcome and you have lots of explanations that can plausibly explain that outcome. Some of those explanations are that in the aftermath of a banking crisis, we decided to very heavily regulate banks, which for many banks raised the costs of extending loans, particularly medium-sized banks. And guess what? Medium-sized banks account for a disproportionate share of loans to small and middle-sized businesses. We also introduced a lot of new transfer payments to households, all of which phased out as people started to earn income. So the very people who are trying to enter or re-enter work also face losses of transfer payments when in doing so. So it's effectively a tax. But in particular, there were two anomalies with this recovery that we identified when we were thinking about why is this such a slow recovery. So one thing that stood out was prime age labor force participation. So prime age workers are people between the ages of 25 and 54. These are people in their peak work years. And between the start of the recovery in July 2009, so this is after the recession has ended, from July 2009 through the end of December 2016, 1.6 million Americans between the ages of 25 and 54 left the labor force. That means they didn't have a job, nor were they actively looking for a job. 1.6 million. And this is despite the fact that the US economy was continuing to grow during that period. The second thing that really stood out as atypical about this recovery was that businesses in the United States were not investing enough in new plant and equipment per worker in order to just offset depreciation of existing plant and equipment per worker, which was almost unheard of in post-war US history. So, in designing a policy response to these two anomalies, one of the responses, and again, Larry touched on this as being sort of sound tax policy yesterday, is you want to lower marginal rates because people respond to marginal incentives. So lower marginal rates and broaden the base. So what did that look like in 2017? Well, the US tax code has a lot of what we would call tax expenditures. They're tax credits, they're tax deductions if you do certain things. If you buy a house and you pay interest, mortgage interest on that, you can deduct that mortgage interest from your tax bill. If you live in a really high tax state, you can deduct the state taxes from your tax bill. So what we did is we capped a lot of those tax expenditures and we lowered the marginal rates in order to incentivize increased labor force participation. And we also did something which is to raise the standard allowance. So this is up until a certain point, you don't have to face any income tax liability at all. Now that sort of helps smooth for a lot of these people who may be out of work, receiving transfer payments. As they enter work, you don't want to be imposing a lot of taxes and at the same time that they're losing transfer benefits. So we raised their standard allowance. And on the business investment side, we lowered the statutory income tax rate, which had been the highest of any advanced economy at 35%. We lowered that to 21%. And we also said, if you're a business and you buy a new piece of equipment, forklift, tractor, truck, you can immediately write that off. That you can immediately deduct that from your tax liability. Now, what were the effects? The US had, and all other major economies, all other G7 economies had productivity growth from 2009 to 2016 of about 1%. Among G7 economies, the US was then the only economy to observe its productivity growth rate rise from that 2009 to 2016 average. Business investment, if you estimate a trend in business investment in 2009 to 2016, you project that trend into 2018, 2019, the level of business investment in the US rose to a level that was 10% above that pre-2017 trend. Labor force participation increased across all age cohorts. That prime age cohort, 25 to 54, 2.3 million prime age Americans entered or re-entered the labor force. Remember, 1.6 million of them had left between 2009 and 2016. It was actually at such a point that in late 2019, on the eve of the pandemic, 3/4 of the flows into employment were people coming in from out of the labor force. So previously, they had not been looking for work. Real wage growth, so this is wage growth adjusted for inflation, for the bottom 10% of the income distribution, rose 9.8%. Real wage growth for the top 10% of the income distribution rose 4.8%. So you had wage growth across the distribution, but disproportionately skewed toward the lower end of the distribution. Real wealth, so the total inflation adjusted assets for the top 1% of the wealth distribution rose 9%. Pretty good. 9% is not bad. Real wealth for the bottom 50% of the wealth distribution rose 28%. Labor's share of income rose. Real median household income in 2019 rose $4,400. That was more in 1 year than in the 16 years through 2016 combined. Throughout most of that expansion, worker wage growth have been lagging manager wage growth. Wage growth for those without a college degree have been lagging those with a college degree. Female wages have been lagging wage growth for male workers. Wage growth for minorities have been lagging wage growth for non-minorities. After 2017, those patterns all flipped. And there's kind of an interesting phenomenon here because we're talking about increased labor force participation, more people flowing back into the labor force, yet wages are going up. How could that be? Usually when supply goes up, price goes down. Well, there was an interesting literature on this because it turns out when, and this is a long literature going back to the 1980s, it turns out that more profitable industries tend to pay higher wages because there's bargaining that goes on between workers and managers. And so when there are rents to be shared, it turns out that workers actually get some of those rents as well. And so that big reduction of the corporate income tax rate actually created a windfall that benefited both workers and companies. There's also a bargaining channel. So previously, before the 2017 tax law, we had a tax rate at 35%. Other major advanced economies had a tax rate of about 20%. If you lower that gap, it lowers a company's outside option. So it strengthens labor's bargaining power relative to companies. Third factor is that you basically shift the whole earnings function for a worker when you lower that corporate income tax rate, because now the value to a company of any given level of skill or any given level of education is just higher. And then finally, and most importantly, and this speaks to something that Doug talked about yesterday, productivity. At the end of the day, wage growth comes from productivity growth. And when you lower the cost of capital, you raise the demand for investment. That increases the long-run capital stock. You have more plant and equipment per worker, higher wage growth. So that's where we were on the eve of the pandemic. And mind you, when you have a supply-side driven economic agenda, you can have very low unemployment without inflationary pressure. So we had 24 months of the unemployment rate at or below 4%, and no sign of inflation. Early 2020, the global economy gets hit with a shock of pretty unprecedented magnitude. So for the United States, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, projected that in a two-wave scenario, the COVID shock would result in an economic contraction in the United States of 12.2%. Now that was actually pretty consistent with estimates at the time, real-time estimates from the New York Federal Reserve, whose weekly economic index in March and April of 2020 was showing a contraction for the year of 11%. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projected that the unemployment rate would spike to 16% and stay in double digits through the end of the year. Private forecasts had that going as high as 25%. So this would have been the worst shock since 1932. So in thinking about how do you respond to a shock like this, there were several things that were on our minds. One is that unlike in 2008, 2009, we expected this shock to, for the most part, be transitory. We're told by public health officials 2 weeks to flatten the curve. I don't think anyone actually thought 2 weeks, but we expected that this would be temporary. The other difference, key difference from 2008, 2009, is that in 2008, one could argue that resources in the United States were not efficiently allocated. Perhaps we were overinvested in residential real estate. 2020, early 2020, I don't think there was anyone saying the US economy is inefficiently allocated. We need to shift resources away from services towards goods. We need to have some sort of reallocation. So, if that's the case, this is likely to be a transitory shock, and we think that for the most part, the US economy, factors of production are efficiently allocated, then the priority of economic policy should be just how do we help to preserve some of the contractual relationships that existed on the eve of the pandemic. What are some of those contractual relations? Well, the key one is workers and their employers. It turns out that search and match, so workers and firms searching for each other and trying to find a good match, can actually be a very costly process. It can take a lot of time. And as I said, if we think that these were pretty good matches on the eve of the pandemic, I mean, we'd had, as I said, 24 months of unemployment at or below 4%. So these are probably going to be pretty good matches because any worker who wanted to switch jobs to find a better match could have done so. But if those matches are severed, if people lose jobs, if firms become insolvent, then it can be a very long time before you reconstitute some of those employer and employee matches. So to address that, the main policy responses were two. First, an employee retention tax credit. So basically, if firms held on to their workers, then they could claim some of that back on their tax return. A second and more immediate response was what we called the Paycheck Protection Program, which was the Small Business Administration working through private sector banks would extend loans to small and medium-sized businesses, and those loans would be forgivable provided businesses used the loans to cover payroll costs, to keep workers receiving paychecks. And the reason we limited this to small and medium-sized businesses is because large businesses tend to have a lot of physical capital that they can use as collateral for loans. They have a lot of equity that can provide a buffer for rough times. But small businesses, a lot of their capital is tied up in what we might call organizational capital. The knowledge and efficiencies that have been acquired through just on-the-job work, the relationships you build as a small business. And so that actually leads to a second policy response, which was motivated by the risk of losing a lot of that organizational capital. Because if you have dozens, tens of thousands of small and medium-sized businesses that fail because of this transitory shock, then you lose all of that organizational capital. And it can take a long time to reconstitute it. And all the while, your labor markets, your goods markets are going to be operating at less than full employment. So we did something that I think was kind of clever here, which was we said, if you have a net operating loss in 2020, the year of the pandemic, when a lot of companies had operating losses, you can carry that loss back to 2018 and 2019 when a lot of companies were very profitable, and you can get a tax refund. Now, even though the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, was backlogged, there was still that tax asset that people had, the businesses had, that they had this tax refund that they can claim or they will be able to claim. And the reason I say I think this is kind of clever is because the budgetary cost was very low. Because if these firms survived, then they were always going to have an operating loss that they could carry forward to future years and get a tax refund. If they failed, then they would go into bankruptcy, and that net operating loss would become a tax asset for another firm or another investor who bought them. So those are two, what I think were key features of the economic response in the United States to the COVID pandemic. What were the outcomes? Well, in part, due to the peculiar nature of the pandemic recession, this was the shortest recession in US history. It officially ended in April 2020. And I don't think there can be much dispute about the fact that it ended in 2020, April 2020, because in May 2020, the US economy added 2.8 million jobs, June 2020, 4.8 million jobs, July 1.7, August 1.6. The unemployment rate peaked at 14.7% compared to the Congressional Budget Office's forecast of 16%, and ended the year already back down to 6.7%. If we look at the broadest measure of labor market underutilization, this we call U6, it includes people who are working part-time for economic reasons, it includes people who are marginally attached to the labor force. That ended 2020 at 11.7%, which was less than in August 2014, 5 years into the previous recovery. And in fact, some estimates suggest that the Paycheck Protection Program preserved as many as 18 million jobs in the US. Gross domestic product, output of the US economy, ended the year down 1.5%. That means that it had recouped 80% of its decline in the first and second quarters, while employment had recovered 60% of the jobs lost by December 2020. And the US economy by the first quarter of 2021 had already regained its pre-pandemic level. Now thereafter, I think some of the other measures of the pandemic response became more manifest, and I'm going to talk about those tomorrow, and in particular measures that were enacted, implemented after the recovery was already well underway. But I'll save that for, as I said, tomorrow. Because I want to return to that plucking model. So we've had two big plucks in the past 15 years, two big plucks. And we think a lot about the plucks, those downward plucks on the string. And it's right that we should, because as I said, they're very costly, especially when it's a slow recovery, such as in the aftermath of 2008, 2009. But consider this. In any given year since 1945, the probability that the US economy enters recession, that it receives a pluck, is 16% about. The probability that the UK, that the United Kingdom, enters a recession in any given year since 1945, can anyone guess? So the US is 16%. Do you want to guess what the UK's is? I'm sorry? 20. 7. Probably, according to the latest recession dates, the probability that the UK economy enters recession in any given year since 1945 is 7%. And it turns out that the UK has been much less recession prone than the United States for the past 200 years. The average economic expansion in the UK since the end of the Second World War, 212 months. The average US expansion since the end of the Second World War, 64 months. Even before World War II, the average UK expansion was 89 months. The average US expansion, 26. So even the average pre-war UK expansion was longer than the average post-war US expansion. The longest UK expansion on record, 26 years. The longest US expansion on record, 10.5 years. And we can get into, I'd be delighted to talk about why that is. But I want to point out that yet, the UK economy, the UK, is on average 30 to 40% poorer per capita than the United States, and has been poorer per capita since the late 19th century. Indeed, actually, the United States is increasingly remarkable. Larry and I were talking about this the other night. The US is increasingly remarkable. In terms of GDP per capita, the United States is now pretty much in the sole company of small oil-rich countries and tax havens in terms of real GDP per capita. The only other economy that comes close, the only other large diversified economy that comes close is Australia. You look at the rest of Western Europe, you look at Japan, and it's a 30 to 40% gap to the United States. Yes? So Switzerland is one of the tax havens. Yep, great question. So what really matters for long-run prosperity is the long-run trend growth rate. The UK, as I said, less recession-prone, lower trend growth rate. And more often than not, a few years after a pluck, a few years after a recession, turns out the economy tends to look pretty similar to how it would have looked if it had continued without that costly interruption. It's really pretty remarkable. So if it hadn't fallen victim to that costly deviation, even after the deviation, a few years out, it looks pretty similar. So this reminds me of some observations of Adam Smith's, looking at comparative economic performance in 1776. Smith observed of China at the time that China's economy seemed to be, and seemed for some time to have been, what he called stationary. It wasn't backsliding, it wasn't shrinking, but nor was it really growing. And he wrote this: China has perhaps acquired that full complement of riches which the nature of its laws and institutions permit it to acquire. Implicit in that statement is that China could have had a higher complement of riches with a different set of laws and institutions. What might those institutions look like? Well, I'll conclude with this line of Smith's from the same publication. Quote, "Little else is required to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable, mind you, not perfect, but a tolerable administration of justice. All the rest being brought about by the natural course of things." I want to leave plenty of time for questions, so I will pause there. Yes?
First of all, thank you for the lecture. When you mentioned that the US and Australia were the only major economies that in the long run had a higher growth rate than the UK, let's say, is it because of the availability of an abundance of land and energy in Australia and the US because of its sheer size and massive resources, while the UK is a much smaller country?
So there are a lot of contributions. I would say, at least in recent decades, demographics is one. The UK, Western Europe, and certainly Japan are aging much more rapidly. Their peak population cohorts were earlier than in the United States, so there's a demographic factor to this. I think that there's also a tax aspect to this, that the United States has a very progressive tax system that has low rates for the majority of Americans. So you have to be, in the United States, you have to be earning 8.5 times the average wage before you're paying the top marginal income tax rate. In the UK, you're earning 3.5 times the average wage, you are already paying the top marginal rate. In much of Western Europe, in Scandinavia, if you're earning 1.2, 1.4 times the average wage, you are paying the top marginal income tax rate. So I think that impacts labor force participation, that impacts entrepreneurship. with the United Kingdom actually has a very low utilization of its lands, in large part because of restrictions. There was a 1947 Town and Country Planning Act by Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee that imposed severe restrictions on the ability to build in the United Kingdom. And in fact, the UK, by some measures, has less built up area, less land with stuff built on it today than it did in the year 2000. A final hypothesis is that part of the cause for the stability of the UK economy, I actually think could also factor into its lower trend growth rate. And Larry might appreciate this hypothesis, might want to push back. We'll see. But historically, the UK banking system has been a nationwide banking system. So you had thousands of branches operating throughout the British economy, but not that many banks, a few hundred banks. So if you think of a national economy as like a portfolio, if you're broadly diversified to different regions, different sectors, if a shock arrives, a harvest failure or some other local real estate shock, you can maybe weather that shock because you're diversified. In contrast, for most of US history, you couldn't do that. I mean, not only could a bank not operate multiple establishments across state lines, they couldn't even operate multiple establishments within the same state. So we had tens of thousands of these small, undiversified, undercapitalized banks. So whenever a shock comes along, you get waves of bank failures that just amplify the shock. Now, how does that relate to growth? Well, the cost to the UK of having that big national banking system is that British banks have never been particularly interested in lending to small and medium-sized businesses. That's not what the big British banks did. Because you think about, if I'm a small business looking to grow, I might not have much collateral or any collateral. I might not have much of a credit history. And the big British banks were like, well, that's kind of costly. I'd rather be lending to canal companies in Egypt. I'd rather be underwriting Argentine bonds. And in contrast, one positive feature of the US financial system is we developed a much more robust system of venture capital. And also all those thousands of small banks do engage in what we call relationship banking. So you get to know your local community, you get to know the trustworthiness, the creditworthiness of potential borrowers, and so you can maybe provide some credit to those small and medium-sized enterprises. But this is a long-winded answer to your question, but it's a very important question because it goes back a long way. There was actually a parliamentary report in 1931 called the Macmillan Report, and it identified what it called the Macmillan Gap, which was this chunk of medium-sized British industries that couldn't get credit. And so I think that's why that's a part of why the US has just been more entrepreneurial over the years, over the decades, centuries, is because of that credit aspect.
Tyler, thank you for having the good sense during the COVID crisis to realize it's much harder to restart a business that's gone bankrupt and re-employ the people than to keep what was an otherwise profitable business going until things recovered.
Thanks.
You all owe you a debt of gratitude for that.
Thanks.
Let's just say that in January of 2025, we're fortunate enough to have you going back into your prior position, Council of Economic Advisors. What would be the elements that you would be paying attention to that had changed relative to when you left, and what would be your policy prescriptions to the incoming president?
So I think a key thing that has changed is that we are no longer in the world of very low real interest rates and an abundant supply of undetected labor market slack. In 2017, we passed a tax law that was scored at $1.5 trillion over 10 years. If you incorporate the macroeconomic feedback from that, so the higher tax revenues as a result of growth, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that that would claw back about half a trillion dollars. At the time, the U.S. economy was growing at about 2.5%. And the real interest that the U.S. government was paying on its debt was pretty close to 0%. So there's that delta. And if you can pass a tax law that even conservatively costs less than 1% of GDP and has all those other effects that I mentioned, raises the future capital stock of the U.S. economy, boosts wages, it makes a lot of sense to take that bet. What I worry is that, and I would love to make a lot of the provisions of those provisions permanent. What I worry is that we have now in the past 2 years entered a world of higher and rising real interest rates that make the debt situation of the U.S. more concerning and less sustainable. Because, as you know, if the interest cost on your debt exceeds the rate of growth of the economy, the economy is the underlying tax base, then you can be running budget surpluses every day until the cows come home, but your debt burden is still going to be growing as a share of your economy. So that is a big concern of mine, is what has happened to the real cost of servicing our debt and what is likely to happen to the real cost of servicing our debt. I think in terms of policy, there are a few ways to get out of that sort of debt burden. One is you can run primary budget surpluses. I don't anticipate the political economy will permit that anytime soon. You can generate some surprise inflation. I wouldn't want to do that. And you can only fool people so many times before they catch on and they demand higher rates. You can engage in financial repression. You can force banks to buy your debt. I wouldn't recommend that. So we're kind of left with, you got to generate some growth. So there are some provisions in the 2017 tax law that I would like to make permanent and expand upon. So I would like to make that full expensing of equipment investment permanent. I would like to expand that to buildings and to all intellectual property. And you could probably, you could fully fund that by completely eliminating the mortgage interest deduction and the state and local tax deduction. I don't know if there's the political will to do that, but right there, you could have a fully funded tax change that would probably boost the size of the U.S. economy by 3 to 5%.
Hello, yeah. I guess I'm not as familiar with tax and legislation, so I just wanted to ask, could you explain to me, if you were to explain to a 5-year-old, what were when you said something about the operating loss, and then them asking for a tax refund, and then if the opposite happened and they weren't working at a loss or something like that, then it's a tax asset?
Yes.
So could you just explain that in short terms, maybe, because I'm not as familiar?
Yeah, no, thank you. So a net operating loss means, so let's say in this tax year, my expenses were greater than my revenues, so I lost $100 this year. Now, the tax code likes to let businesses smooth out their income over time, because some businesses are just very lumpy. And if you don't have that ability to carry losses forward or back, then you're going to be taxing businesses with the same average income over time, you're actually going to be taxing them differently. So the carryback means this year I had a loss of $100. Last year I had a profit of $1,000 on which I paid tax. With the carryback, I can take that $100 and say last year and apply it to last year's $1,000. You deduct it from those $1,000, so then you only have to pay tax on $900. And the carry forward is the analog for bringing it forward to a future tax year. So let's say next year I have $1,000 in profit. I can deduct this year's $100 loss from next year's $1,000 profit.
Is it universal, this thing, or is it just in the States? How is it?
It is pretty common across tax jurisdictions because, as I said, you don't want to be taxing companies, you don't want to be taxing businesses that have the same average income over time. You don't want to be taxing them at different rates. So this helps smooth, lumpy tax liabilities over time.
Tom, could you give some insight to the students here about the human dynamics of what's happening with this decision making as all this is going on? I mean, you're at the Council of Economic Advisors, right? So there's a lot of dynamics. At that point, somebody made a decision to shut down the economy. Who made that decision? And when they made that decision, who did they ask what the implications would be? And when all these complex decisions were being made, in order to execute this, again, you're sitting in the White House with a whole bunch of people around, but the United States has a lot of stuff going on. There's a Congress, and you've got to run this through, there's a ways and means to it. Could you go through the human dynamics of what happens when this complex policy goes from somebody's head to execution?
Yeah, so in normal times, there's what's called a policy process in the White House. Because you think of any economic issue or any policy issue, and there are a lot of different agencies that have a stake in that policy. So student loans. The Department of Education has an interest in what we do on student loans. The Department of the Treasury has an interest in what we do on student loans. The Council of Economic Advisors, because we're economists and we think about costs and benefits, we have an interest in what we do on student loans. And so a policy coordinating committee, and there are three, there's a Domestic Policy Council, there's a National Economic Council, and there's a National Security Council. Their job is to coordinate all the different interested parties, get them in a room, starting at the staff level, and work out all their differences. Whatever they can't work out at the staff level gets kicked up to the deputies. The deputies hash out what they can. What the deputies can't agree upon moves up to the principals. So the principals are the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce, the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And what the principals can't agree to, then it goes to the Oval Office. Now, I will say that when it came to the pandemic, there was a profound unwillingness within the federal public health community to listen to the economists or to even let us in the room. We had to fight to get in the room because the view was, this is a public health issue, this is for public health experts, not for economists. And we had to fight to get into those meetings because we wanted to make the point that there are many dimensions here. There are benefits to certain interventions, perhaps, although there's a lot of uncertainty about whether there are going to be benefits, but there are also a lot of costs. So I actually remember with my team, we did a lot of work estimating the other public health costs and the economic costs of some of the interventions that were ultimately implemented at both the national and state levels. And I actually wrote a public piece on this that had a very difficult time placing, because at that time, no one wanted to go against what the public health officials were insisting upon. But
what was your job exactly at that point?
so that was that was just before I became acting chair. And it was a piece on the economic and other public health costs of continued lockdowns, and it eventually ended up in the New York Post. They took it.
Yeah,
But
the New York Post is not making public policy.
correct.
The question is, you've got something. Where is that going inside the policy-making dynamics in the government?
So inside the policymaking dynamics, that was early in the pandemic. I was a deputy, so I was going to every deputy meeting I could to make the strongest economic arguments I could. And then when I became a principal, did the same at the principal's level.
And who was responsible for making the decision?
Ultimately, that is the executive branch.
It's a very broad term, Tyler. Who? What individual?
So it was the COVID task force that would ultimately make a recommendation to the president, and then it's implemented.
And what was the involvement of the Congress?
Congress's involvement was mostly to allocating funds for both the economic policy response and for funding the public health measures. So
In the United States, for the U.S. Constitution, tax policy starts in the Congress.
yes.
So how did this play out in this scenario?
So the way this played out in the scenario is that first, Congress passed a few emergency bills to help with preparedness, provide funds for state and local governments, state and local public health officials. Then in March, Congress passed the large CARES Act, which included that Paycheck Protection Program, included the Employee Retention Tax Credit, included economic impact payments, and included a whole bunch of other economic policy responses.
Hi Tyler, thank you very much for the lecture. I'll start with that. 2 questions if that's okay. Looking a bit at the legal part of insolvency in Israel, one of the things the legislature did was able to grant a moratorium that halts the proceedings to companies for 3 months without going to actual administration proceedings. So that helped companies actually gain their ground in order to move forward. And I believe England, the UK did a very similar thing with moratorium. And I wanted to know if there's was there, apart from the tax thing you spoke about, was there any change in Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code that you thought that might help the U.S. companies prevent bankruptcy?
So there were a lot of what we call forbearance measures, and this was an issue that arose early during the pandemic when, in frantic meetings, and I guess this speaks to Bob's earlier question, in frantic weekend meetings before Congress acted, because Congress never acts unless they absolutely have to, and sometimes not even then. So we're sort of fishing around. So what tools are at our disposal if we need to act as an executive branch? And this question came up about sort of what I might call cost mitigation. You have debts that are coming due, you have student loan payments that are coming due, you have rent that's coming due, and can we introduce forbearance so that those expenses can be deferred? Now, my view was that generally speaking, income replacement is more efficient than cost mitigation. Because then you're just trying to play whack-a-mole, like, oh gosh, we got to do student loans, we got to do rent, we got to do this, we got to do that. The more efficient thing to do is to just replace lost income, which we have an automatic program to do. It's unemployment insurance. And companies pay into that insurance pool such that when there are employment losses, unemployment insurance can replace 50% of lost income. Now in 2020, a complication was that 22 million Americans were losing employment all at once. So when consumption is 70% of your economy, do you really want 22 million people to be losing 50% of their income all at once? And that's why Congress decided to supplement that income replacement with a supplemental payment. We, at the time, I remember many meetings, again, on frantic weekends, trying to make the case we really should not let this income replacement go above 100%. You don't want people to be earning more in unemployment insurance than in employment. But several states had such antiquated IT systems that they could not do a percentage replacement of lost income. They could only do a dollar amount replacement. So that's why Congress ended up doing a $600 supplement to weekly unemployment insurance benefits, which meant that at one point, almost 80% of Americans were earning more, or could be earning more on unemployment insurance than in employment.
Thank you. Just one more question, if that's okay. You mentioned your successful way of ending the recession and the tax issue. How does that relate to other countries' ways of ending the recession? And would there be anything else looking back that you might have done differently?
So it is interesting that a lot of countries did end up arriving at similar policy responses in terms of recognizing that we should try to preserve matches of employers and employees. In the UK, it was a furlough scheme. In Germany has historically had a sort of work sharing program, so you reduce hours rather than reducing employment. We ended up having to doing the PPP because, as I said, the federal government is a slow-moving giant that just didn't have the infrastructure to stand up these loans. Whereas if you work through the banks, most small and medium-sized businesses have some sort of banking relationship, so you can get those funds out, and you can have the screening because banks have screening protocols in place. In terms of things that I would do differently, I thought that if you want to target income replacement, the way to target income replacement is through unemployment insurance. And you can supplement. And while everything is locked down, it actually doesn't even matter that much if you're replacing 100% of income or even more than 100%, because no one was really looking for work in March, April, May 2020 because everything was shut down. That distortion grows as the recovery proceeds. But we also did, and I think other countries did this as well, what were called economic impact payments. So Congress passed in the CARES Act and subsequent acts, they included sending checks to households. And that's untargeted. And in retrospect, I think the magnitudes were probably overkill, especially when you get to March 2021, where you're over 10 months into recovery, you have vaccines, and we sent checks of $1,400, in 2021, the Biden administration sent checks of $1,400 to every household, or every household earning under a certain income threshold. So I think those stimulus payments were overkill, and it doesn't really make sense to be stimulating demand when you have a supply shock.
So thank you, Taylor, for your talk. Since the UAE was founded in 1971 till 2018, we didn't have any taxation system here in the UAE. On the 1st of January 2018, we had it was implemented the 5% value-added tax, and we still don't have any income tax or property tax. So, do you think, are there any indications that show that the UAE will change this taxation system and we will have any income or property tax, or you don't see that anytime soon?
Well, most states tend to add additional revenue streams rather than remove revenue streams. But I would note that, generally speaking, economists think of consumption taxes, and a value-added tax is sort of a consumption tax, and taxes on immovable property are more efficient taxes than taxing income. And I think it's interesting that as mobile as capital and income are across international borders, they're even more mobile across intranational borders, so within a country. And isn't it interesting that more than 200 years of competition between US states has resulted in a state of affairs in which the number one and number two sources of revenue at the subnational level in the United States are sales taxes and property taxes, which are more efficient taxes than income. So if you can fund what is required with a VAT, then hopefully you'll stick with that.
Thank you for the informative lecture. I was curious, you were discussing how the pandemic was the shortest recession in the U.S. history. So I was curious, in your opinion, what steps can the U.S. take to enhance their resilience to future crises or recessions?
So part of it goes back to Mohammed's question earlier, and my answer to that, which is I would like to see continued evolution in the US banking system. We still have 4,300 banks. If you include other types of depository institutions, I think it's a few thousand more than that. That's a more resilient banking system than even just 40 years ago when we still had 15,000 commercial banks. But the more banks continue to diversify across the country, then even if you have a collapse in residential real estate or commercial real estate in San Francisco, which might be coming soon, then a broadly nationally diversified bank can absorb that shock. So I think continued evolution of the US banking system is one thing. And then I would like to see something like a work sharing program that Germany has, an improvement on the Paycheck Protection Program such that in the event of an adverse shock, in the event of a recession, we can help companies to reduce hours rather than reduce employment. I mean, I think you have to be somewhat careful because there is often reallocation that happens in when there's a recession, and maybe some of that reallocation isn't the worst thing, but you want to. It's nice if you can mitigate a lot of the collateral damage.
Yes, Professor, thank you for your lecture. So, if you don't mind, I have two questions. The first one is that, do you really think that policies implemented for recovery or in order to recover from crisis depend actually to each crisis or each recession? Shedding light on the most recent recessions we witnessed. The first one is 2008, and it was, as we know, a credit crisis. There were actually some unconventional monetary policies that were implemented in order to, if I can say, get from the crisis by injecting, for example, quantitative easing, by injecting a huge amount of money into the economy through asset purchases by the central bank, and also the most recent pandemic crisis. Actually, the policies that were implemented were characterized by a huge amount of money injected into the economy through direct transfers to households. And the second question
Wait, so sorry, just repeat that the central question.
The idea of the question is: do you really think that to each crisis their own policies to get from it? And the second one, a little bit reopens a debate that, if I can say, most of macroeconomists don't want to get involved in, is about the fail of macroeconomists to anticipate the crisis of 2008. And can we really say that does this fail, if I can say that, cast doubt on the new classical DSG models who actually which fail to anticipate, to preview that crisis specifically?
Well, I would add that the models also fail to anticipate the inflation that we've had of the past 2 years. And in fact, if you take the Federal Reserve's signature model that they've been operating for years and that they use at every meeting, you can plug in a deficit finance fiscal stimulus equal to 10% of the US economy, as the Biden administration did in March 2021. And you can repeat that, I think, for 3 years. And the FERBUS model, the Fed's model, spits out that I think the inflation rate rises by 0.5 percentage point. So you got to take all those with a grain of salt. I would actually I might actually give the same answer sort of to both questions, which is that macroeconomists didn't see it coming because fundamentally recessions tend to be about shocks, about adverse shocks. And they can be very different. I mean, it can be a credit crisis, it can be an oil price spike. Often it's a cluster of shocks. And so in a way they are unpredictable. They're sort of always unpredictable. And a lot of people tend to think that, well, as an economic expansion matures, as it gets older, then there are fragilities or imbalances that accumulate, making a recession more probable. But for the US over the past 80 years, that's actually not true. It turns out that expansions, as Ben Bernanke once quipped, expansions don't die of old age, they're murdered. And there are a number of serial killers of economic expansions out there, oil crises, the Federal Reserve is one often. But in the UK, it has pretty much always been the case that expansions don't die of old age. So you had sort of 16-year economic expansions in the 19th century UK. And we're getting better. We're actually getting better at absorbing these shocks. So I think 3 of the longest expansions in US history have been in the past 40 years. The 1980s, the 1990s. The longest expansion in US history was the one that ended in the COVID pandemic. So we're getting better at absorbing the kinds of shocks that cause recessions, but I think shocks are always going to happen, and they're always going to be different. They're always going to be unique.
Yeah. I have also a 2-part. As we both know, your colleague at Hoover, John Cochran, he likes to spend a lot of time talking about, how the difference between a 2% growth and a 3% growth and what it means over time with compound interest. And I was just would appreciate your thoughts on how can a country get from that 2% to 3% to 4%. And you talked about the aftermath of 2008, so with a slower recession, the clock wasn't as. So how do we how do we make that buck better? How do we get to that higher growth rate? And the second question is that the inflation that we're experiencing since 2021 was attributed to the spending happened in the in the response to COVID. So in that respect, so from your point of view, was it sort of like worth it in a sense? Like, so now we're sort of like paying the cost of the pandemic rescue plan in a way of inflation. So like when you look at it, was there like any better way to get out of it, given that we closed off the economy and this was a response, and now we have inflation. So was it worth it in a sense? So two big questions.
Yeah, and I might save the second one mostly for tomorrow, but on the first, it's hard, and it's getting harder, because while it's not completely true that demographics are destiny, demographics matter a lot. And the peak cohort of the post-war baby boom generation in the United States was born in 1957. Those folks all turned 65 last year and are exiting the labor force. One interesting thing about long-run forecasting is that it's actually fairly arithmetic. What do we think is going to be the working age population? What do we think is labor? What do we think labor force participation will be? What do we think will be average hours worked? What do we think will be productivity per hour? And productivity per hour worked is a function of the composition of the labor force, how much skill people have, how much education, and it's also a function of how much capital do they have to work with. So in terms of getting from the sort of 2% where we are now in terms of potential to a 3%, I mean, ideally you'd like to have more working people. You would like to have more skilled people. And so I would actually say a great policy thing to do, that goes back to the earlier question, is incentivizing people with a lot of human capital to stay in the labor force. And turns out that actually young people don't respond too much to changes in personal income tax rates because they acquire a lot of human capital on the job that is going to pay dividends for years. But older workers who are maybe on the fence about retiring or not, it turns out that they're really responsive to changes in personal income tax rates. So if you can make some of these marginal rate reductions permanent, then a lot of near retirement or retirement age workers who have a lot of skill might decide to stay in the labor force for a bit longer. And then I think another policy lever would be that you want to increase, as I said, the amount of capital that people are able to work with. And one way to do that is to lower the cost of capital, such as by allowing businesses to fully expense the cost of new investment in buildings, in equipment, in intellectual property in the year in which those costs are incurred. And then down the road, workers have a lot more plant and equipment to work with, they're more productive, and maybe you can get from 2% to 3%.
You were given a clue that you are worrying about the economy in San Francisco. So if you can elaborate on that, and in the same time you were saying that you are getting better at getting a shock. So if you can tell something about the plan that you have in this issue.
Yeah, so San Francisco isn't quite Venezuela, but they have been making a lot of bad policy decisions for many years, and they have very high tax rates. They have a very high regulatory burden. Just to register as a small business with the franchise board in the state of California, you have to pay $800. I mean, that's a lot for a lot of small businesses. And the city of San Francisco, it has benefited from being right next to Silicon Valley. You have a lot of tech startups in and around San Francisco. And yet, so you want people to be able to move there. You want people to be able to benefit from high productivity growth. But San Francisco has one of the most restrictive regimes when it comes to building. So you basically can't build anything anywhere near anyone in the Bay Area. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but not much. And that has a whole host of adverse consequences, one of which is a severe homelessness problem in San Francisco. So in terms of the US economy's resilience more broadly, and so why do I worry about San Francisco? It's because a lot of financial institutions have commercial real estate loans on their books, including commercial real estate loans in San Francisco. And as businesses leave San Francisco, and they are leaving, venture capitalists are leaving. They're going to Houston, they're going to Dallas, they're going to Miami. That's going to impair the value of a lot of those loans. And I think that we could see some more bank failures as a result. But as for the US economy as a whole, there are several factors, I think, at work. One is we're a less physical capital intensive economy than we were 30, 40 years ago. So we're less sensitive to interest rates. Back in the early 1980s, 60% of US business investment was in buildings, which last for a long time. So they tend to be very interest rate sensitive because you have to take out a big loan to purchase them. Whereas now, intellectual property is a much bigger part of the US economy. We've shifted away from manufacturing to services, and manufacturing can be very volatile. Services are much less volatile, and consumer spending on services is one of the most stable components in the US economy. So I think that structural shift has meant that we're less prone to recession than we were even 30, 40 years ago. And also you look at the composition of spending, even within goods consumption, durable goods, so the bulky goods that people take out personal loans to buy, they're just a smaller share of people's consumption baskets. And then the additional factor, the additional change is the one I mentioned earlier, that 40 years ago, we still had 15,000 banks. In many states, they still, as late as the early 1980s, they still couldn't operate multiple branches. They still couldn't acquire, an out-of-state bank couldn't acquire an in-state bank. So you had a lot of undiversified, somewhat fragile banks, and that has changed. So these are all structural factors that make me somewhat optimistic that we're getting better at this stuff.
So just a quick follow-up. So you were just mentioning the banking crisis, and recently we had the failures of Silicon Valley Bank and other medium-sized bank in the US. Do you think that what happened would lead to more centralization of banks? You would have fewer banks that are much bigger and more diversified, which will reduce the impact of shocks.
Yes. Now the risk there is you don't want to end up with 5 banks and only 5 banks, but some degree of size and broad diversification is generally a good thing. It was characteristic of the British economy for many years, and even as the British banking system consolidated, and oftentimes a bank would get into trouble, but the banking system as a whole would be solvent, so a stronger bank would acquire the assets of a weaker bank. Even though you had a shrinking number of banks in the United Kingdom, you still had a lot of banking competition, because it turns out that whereas you used to just have one local bank, now Barclays Bank and Westminster Bank, these big national banks, both operated a branch in that same town. And anytime one of them would open a new branch in a new place, the other would make sure to open a branch in a new place. And there have been some studies that have found the same thing here in the United States, which is, yes, your JP Morgan Chase, your Citigroup, your Bank of America are getting bigger, but they're also competing with each other. So every town is going to have a Bank of America, a JP Morgan, a Citi. But the risk is increasingly depositors might perceive that a deposit at Bank of America or Citigroup is not the same as a deposit at a smaller bank, because Bank of America is going to get rescued or bailed out if they ever get into trouble, whereas the little bank might be allowed to fail. So that is a risk.
Thank you very much.